Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this. Got invited to just share a little bit about myself and BrightHive and some of the work we're doing, but mostly looking forward to discussing with all of you what you guys are working on, how some of the work we're doing relates to your work, how some of the things we'll talk about resonates or doesn't. Here we go, we'll admit Ronnie as well. Great. So without further ado, let's get started. So today I'm going to be talking about responsible data sharing as a foundation for AI for good and responsible AI. A little bit about myself. I'm just a friendly neighborhood data nerd. My career path to date has been me trying to do data science for good in a number of places across government, academia, as well as an entrepreneur. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those varied experiences and talking about what I've learned along the way and mostly what I've learned from other people. A little bit about my company. Founded it with 5 other folks who are all data nerds as well. We focus on enabling responsible data sharing and purposeful reuse of data. We are a public benefit corporation, so we have a kind of public benefit mission baked into our bylaws, and I can get fired if I don't do that. Functionally, what we do is our software enables organizations to share data with each other and collaborate with external data partners. So, today I'm hoping what we can talk about are 4 things. I'm going to lead with my main point, the thing that I want us to want to communicate to all of you. To do a little bit of background storytelling about how I personally arrived at that point. Share a little bit about some of the work we've done, and hopefully spend most of the time talking about what we can do together as part of the larger ecosystem around AI for good. So with that, kind of my main point is that how we share data is much more important, in my opinion, than how we build algorithms. When it comes to ensuring that the AI we build is ultimately socially beneficial, reduces social harms, etc. That I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the rules and norms we establish around data sharing will do more to determine whether we're in a utopian or dystopian future around AI than the specific kind of implementations and technologies we use to build AI. This argument is based on 2 categories of thought for me. One is just the nature of the data economy and where money is being made and where money will continue to be made or grow in the data economy. And there are kind of 3 assertions I make around the data economy and AI. The first is AI development is constrained in 2 ways in its growth: data access and compute power. And that means in the market, you see essentially 2 main strategies around AI. One is, well, let's use all the open data we can get because it's open, and compete on compute and just like do longer training times. So you see this with the GPT versioning with OpenAI and Google and BERT and others. They're essentially trying to train on all public data on the internet with these like large language models, and they're getting better and better just by throwing more compute hours at them with some new techniques, obviously, but that's the main strategy. And the second is to compete on kind of private data access and say we've got kind of better training. Our AI has learned more from examples that no one else has access to, and kind of the speed of acquisition of new data is the constraint on improvements in the AI. And so my view on this is that data sharing is going to be core to the dominant strategy we're going to see over the market in the next few years. That the kind of because the largest source of untapped value and impact in the data economy is sharing of private data for AI training. And you see these in, see this point, this is not a novel point for me. This is the main point that the McKinsey World Economic Forum report put out with their $3 trillion annually in untapped value from inter-enterprise data sharing. And most of that is its ability to improve AI. Any kind of questions or comments on this argument? Let's see if there are, but I'll just keep the chat open. Oh, we got Liz Taylor. Great. So that's true, just like the dynamics in the marketplace right now. But I feel like it's also true that when we look at where power lies in the data economy around AI development, that how we share data, the rules and norms around it, is also the way that we shift that power. And this is a very simplified model of how data tends to flow through the AI development process, from individual data owners who are generating the data is theirs by right, to data stewards who might be sitting on a database of aggregate data from millions or thousands of those individual data owners, to the data scientists that then get access to that data, or the data teams that get access to that data to build new data products on top of it, to management that has to think about what's the impact of what's being built out of the new AI, or what's the business model around it, how do we incorporate it into our products to either make money or drive social impact. And I think a lot of our data AI for good efforts focus in on the data scientists as the kind of nexus of power and control. Say, all right, let's work on a set of community norms, right? Or the ability for that data scientists, as they're building and implementing models, to check them for bias, to make sure that they're incorporating some version of best practices or principles into the nature of their work. And I think that's a fine thing for us to be focusing on. But I think that's actually missing the bigger area of impact for us as a community. And an example of this actually from my own experience and our own work in the past was a project where several of my colleagues were working on predicting high school dropouts for a large urban school district. And in doing this, they said, all right, we'd like to get access to all the students' data, their whole panel of the work that of their experience at school. And the reason for this is that, if we can incorporate all of the data about everything that's happened from K-12 through high school, our predictions are going to be better. Right? We're going to have greater precision. We're going to have more beautiful, RC curves, and so that's what they did. They said we're going to incorporate, we're going to use all the data, and the team that was doing kind of the management of the partnership said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense too, because we're going to get the best outcomes. We'll be able to, hopefully improve these things for the students the best. But when they talked to the data stewards, right, the folks at the district, they had a very different viewpoint on this. They said, no, we want you to use only this year's data in making predictions for a student. And our reason is that we have kind of a fundamental ethic in our school district that says we don't want a student's past to be kind of outcome determinative or predetermine what their future is going to be like. We think of each year as a reset for that student, an opportunity for them to re-engage. And we want that reflected not just in the way we talk about and work with our students, but even in the algorithms that get built to help them. And this was a very different view on what good AI was, right? From the data scientist management standpoint, good AI was the AI that did the best job at predicting the thing that they were setting out to predict. But from the data owners and data stewards standpoint, good AI was AI that in its implementation was aligned with the principles that they held around their relationship, their social contract with each other. And I think that's a really important thing for us as a community to consider, right? Whose notion of good is the most important for creating AI that does good? I'm not saying that like the data science team that said good here is preventing the most dropouts, that their reasoning for that wasn't really well reasoned and wasn't a fine definition of good. But ultimately, what we as a community have to grapple with is whose definition of good in this case and in every other case is ultimately going to win the day. When we think about my personal suspicion on this is that because the impacts are felt on the data owners and the data stewards are closest, they actually hold the fiduciary responsibility around the data for the data owners. It's the definition of good needs to come from the data owners or the data stewards. It can't be set by us as the algorithm developers. And that means that we've got to figure out where the power shifts from that data owner and data steward to the data scientist and process, and focus at least part of our efforts around AI for good in providing guardrails at that leverage point of power. And so this is kind of my second major point for making the case that data sharing is critical for good AI. Good data sharing is critical for good AI, is that individual and community empowerment, I think, comes through how we ultimately share the data, rather than kind of the commitments we make on how, as a community of data scientists, we're going to go about building algorithms. Because that's a leverage point for impacted stakeholders. That's where they get to set the terms and conditions, not ex post. Any questions or comments on that?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. Thanks so much. This is just a really fascinating case. My question, I guess, is individual and community empowerment. Is when you're talking about individual communities, are you talking about, for example, in this case, the students, being empowered, or is it the data stewards, say the school administrators, a mixture of both? Yeah, I know it's a kind of a very basic question, but I'm curious your definition.
Yeah, great question. I think if we look back at this case, the individual student is that kind of individual. What are the ways in which a student may be empowered for determining kind of how AI is applied to their own case? And the data steward really represent, in this case, it was the kind of school administrators. It was the database administrator for that school district who held kind of fiduciary responsibility over the data on all the students. That was her primary job. And stewardship, data stewardship isn't necessarily just the person that writes the kind of SQL script to generate a table that then gets shared with a data scientist. Stewardship extends beyond that to to district leadership, to individual teachers or counselors. So I know I'm simplifying this case a little bit, but I think when I'm using it in this term, individual community, it's the people that are that are ultimately intended for or ultimately the source of the data and those who are impacted by its use. And I know that's a fuzzy definition. There are better definitions for kind of individual and community in the context of data. Actually, data.org is doing a really good project on this right now that I point to a little bit later in the presentation. I'd be curious how other folks think about notions of individual and community in the context of AI for good.
I would say, like, at least from our perspective, we would probably identify largely with the definition that you gave. It is a little fuzzy, but I think that's only because it's highly situational. But I think regardless, like the most important thing is like that individual empowerment to at least know, like, it when it comes to the people whose data it actually is, that they are aware of what its use case will be.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's me, Ronnie. I think that also have some points related to data standards, metadata. So how can people can have more information about these, and how today company can use them, can have good standards to allow everyone to contribute to things like this. I think that there are some points related to strategy in a, let's say, in a broad sense, for instance, in the problem that you introduced to us here. And then on the other point is that, so we know that data is really important, and but if people have no idea about standards, the data standards and metadata, how can you use these? And what are the best, let's say, points from this data that I can use them in order to build up a good model? I agree with you that data is more important, so it's critical, and you should have a good data, but you don't know. You have to have someone that check on it and that said, okay, regarding the quality, it's okay. And when you go to the model path, probably we have to pay attention to some bias that can, let's say, gender, things like this. But there's also information that are related to metadata, so data standards. Yes. I think that's really, really tricky point, but as a community, I think that people have to have more familiar with these things like metadata, data standards. And we know that when we change them from different domains, we have different metadata or different data standards. And this is really hard. If you think that sometimes it would be nice to integrate and to fuse all of these to have a good model in the end, but we know that's pretty tricky because different problem with different domains, they will provide, they will require different data standards, so different metadata. So this is really nice discussion.
That's an excellent point, and I'm excited that you bring that up because we're going to get pretty deep into metadata, the role of metadata in responsible data sharing. So let's come back to that because that is, I think you're spot on. But some of the things that are missing to enable better data for good, and starting it with metadata first.
Great.
So on that, right? I think given all of that, I think we want to have an outsized impact on whether and how AI is used for good. And we've got to focus significant efforts on how data is shared. So I'll provide a little bit of kind of my own personal and BrightHive's journey into responsible data sharing, given that I started mostly nerding out about, hey, let's build cool algorithms to solve cool problems, and begrudgingly got into the kind of much less sexy but essential world of how we functionally share data. And so I'll just say here, me and my other co-founders, we were socially minded data nerds from a variety of different backgrounds across physics, economics, computer science. We all early in our career felt called to the social sector across, I worked at the Treasury, U.S. House of Representatives, a few other places. Natalie worked at NSA and White House. Angel worked at YMCA, but all of us were kind of pulled into public service or social sector work, trying to apply data, right? And all of us were in data science roles in those different contexts. And we all were frustrated by kind of the social sector's general inability to use data effectively. And we developed independently kind of shared opinions about the nature of the problem, that there were legal and technical and bureaucratic silos within and across organizations that just prevented data from being discoverable in the first place, let alone kind of usable, accessible, shareable. There weren't a lot of collaborative R&D projects in data for good at that time, last decade, that really proved out that a small nonprofit could use machine learning effectively, or that a kind of large government could do it without breaking the bank or having some massive contract with Accenture to make it happen. There just weren't enough data for good cases. And there were, also just whether there was willingness or interest, there was kind of lack of organizational capacity and talent. And all of those things were barriers for really cross-sector insight and more data-driven action in the social sector. And I think we also developed an idealistic theory of change for how to fix it, that if we could just create more R&D and initial prototypes, just prove out cases like the predictive analytics case for predicting dropouts, and then build out more open community developed practices, data standards, APIs, more modular tools, and then have a market for technical assistance and change management for social sector organizations, that we would magically transform the social sector and have AI solving all of the world's biggest problems. So some of us, 3 of us helped start a fellowship program to do some of that early stage R&D, collaborative R&D, something called Data Science for Social Good. We had hundreds of fellows that went through that program, hundreds of projects that we did, that we scoped with different social sector organizations. And they range from program evaluation to helping every mother and child complete a particular program with great nonprofits like Nurse Family Partnership. And when it was effective, we would get things like this. Right? Folks would say, we were used to using data to justify our funding decisions, but now we can actually use it to improve what we do. And that was success, some early successes that felt like, oh, great, this collaborative R&D we're doing with these nonprofits is really having an impact, that we were doing machine learning and AI for good. And we said, great, let's do more of that. So myself and other team members did just hundreds of collaborative R&D projects with machine learning and AI across that fellowship program, a consultancy we created called Impact Lab, a center at the university that I was part of at the University of Chicago. And all of these projects had in common that folks were coming together with a shared goal of creating social impact and shared value, with some notion of combining their data and applying fancy algorithms. I think there are plenty of good AI for good stories where we can talk about big problems, awesome team, cool AI, and great success. But the truth is, my frustration over the years has been that we can create a lot of prototypes, but I personally haven't seen a lot of scalable processes, and we've had a lot of failures to achieve sustained impact in this kind of AI for good work. So I think better AI for good stories are ones where we can say, here's the big problem we set out to solve. We had an awesome team, built some great algorithms, and yet there was failure along some dimension. And understanding the nature of that failure is, for me, I think a much more interesting thing for us to do collectively, because we learn more from failures. So I want to tell a few failure stories that come back to the thesis that I led with. So the first is failing to help the homeless in Indiana. I mostly just want to normalize failure a little bit. So the very good idea was, let's use Medicaid dollars to fight homelessness. Right? Let's go ahead and connect a bunch of data systems, be able to identify and predict super utilizers of the system, and then have the outputs of those algorithms ultimately be used to shift dollars from emergency rooms to paying for housing. And there, even though the idea was very good, there was actually already a use case of this happening in a kind of prototype way that the fellowship program had done, or version of it that the fellowship program had done. But ultimately, the failure to help the homelessness population in Indiana came down to we couldn't get the four private health insurers to trust each other enough, each other's data models, each other's kind of potential uses of that data to share the data necessary to implement this very good idea, even if the algorithms were already there. Second is failing to help the unemployed in Chicago. The good idea was great. Let's democratize labor market information and use that, labor market information with some clever AI to give everyone in the Chicagoland area personalized recommendations of what they could do next in their career, what education training programs they could do, what pathways to economic mobility there were. And here, we got some initial data sharing. The algorithms were actually pretty straightforward, but really to do a good job of pathway recommendation, it required sharing of private data beyond the publicly available data sets. And at that time, the set of stakeholders who were at the table just weren't ready to share. Either their data wasn't high enough quality to be put into AI pipelines, or they had business or legal constraints that made it so that they couldn't actually participate and help out. And then lastly, failing to help the poor in Jamaica have power. The very good idea here was build a predictive model using real-time energy data off the grid that could help improve grid reliability in Jamaica. And there, got the data shared, got the algorithms built, got it implemented. But as is often the case with data for good projects, that as those data sharing arrangements and the pipelines that were built on top of them were pretty brittle. And as soon as the team that was deploying that left, shortly thereafter, a few months afterwards, one person who managed one of the data sharing relationships, a key stakeholder, a key data steward, left and didn't transfer the knowledge about this particular downstream use of their data. And as a result, it just pipeline broke and no one was around to be able to fix it. And so it wasn't sustained. And the impact that started to be there ultimately wasn't able to be maintained. So these are all failures in some way that are rooted in the nature of how the data was shared and not in whether the algorithm was good or not, right, or performant or not. We actually did a little bit of a fail con at Good Tech Fest, where I just encourage folks to share some of their other failed data for good project stories. And you can click on the mural there. You'll see what some of the things that folks have shared out, reasons for failure. And a lot of them clustered around some issue of how the data was shared, whether the data was shared, the constraints around its use or lack thereof, that ultimately led to the failure of the project or failure to impact of the AI. Any comments or questions on those failures, or any willingness to share failures that you're aware of or know of that feel resonant with some of the examples I shared?
Yeah, well, Matt, this is Nathan Chappelle. I'm glad you were sharing that, because in my head, I spent 20 years leading nonprofit organizations, and before I went and started in the ML world, and implementation, they're quick to want to do analysis to get insights, but then really used to going back to their old ways. And so that implementation part, I think, is just so top of mind. And even as a service that we work with nonprofit organizations, I mean, implementation is just so hard to get them to make it sticky. And especially with ML, one piece of it is doing the prototype work. The other is tracking those results, having improvements in those models over time. It's really hard. I think it's an inherent issue that nonprofits struggle with, because essentially they're trying to raise money to support their missions. They're underfunded in innovation. So I don't know, to me, it seems like some sort of subsidy or way of incentivizing adoption is going to be critical to helping, you know, kind of more large scale adoption.
Yeah. Tell me more about what you're thinking on that. You know, it sounds like you're thinking around like the funding model for applications. So the funding model for data and its uses in the social sector is broken and
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's a large discussion in itself. But in the funding model of I think making, you know, AI for good sustainable is going to have to include some of the, you know, kind of the operationalizing, you know, of the work to support it. So I mean, the easy part now in ML is actually getting something off the ground. The hard part is, you know, improving and tracking and retraining over time, you know, and you know, that ongoing / consultative / data science type work. And if it's not, if the resources aren't there from the beginning, it's gonna fall short. You know, there should be, well, I won't go. There should be investment in not just doing cool work, but in, you know, going the distance. So I think a lot of organizations, you know, for different reasons, they get scared, the shiny ball syndrome, they don't have the resources, but I just think it needs to be part of the package from the onset.
Yes, that's interesting that it can't. So I know one of the challenges in thinking about that kind of building in sustainability from the outset is that you know, you do want to allow for failure for data projects because sometimes they fail for good reasons. Like it turns out the data is just insufficient, or the you know, the problem was ill-defined, or the thing they're trying to predict is just you know, you can't really predict it well, or you can't model it well, given the nature of the nature of the problem, or the nature of the marketplace. And so I know in talking with funders, there's kind of a concern that, well, if we build in 3 years of implementation funding around an experimental project, it's not really an experiment, right? And I'm curious how you think about balancing that, the need for experimentation, like the R&D aspects of AI for good, with the kind of sustainability, the implementation, sustainability, and growth aspects of AI for good.
I'd be curious to see what others weigh in. You know, for myself, you know, scoping a project out from the onset, both in, you know, targets, what you're trying to accomplish, and what supporting data, you know, to have a reasonable idea. I mean, I agree that there should be defined phases. You know, you don't just go all in the deep end from the very onset, but maybe there's this opportunity to say, if we get past this phase, this would be the commitment, you know, to going, you know, to really leverage what the tool has to offer, you know, because I think it's where everyone leaves frustrated when it's like, well, we did this great prototype, we leave and it disappears. That like nobody wins on that situation. You know, nonprofits like, oh, well, we tried that once and we, you know, it was too complicated. And then whoever did the work is like, I can't believe I did all that work and it's evaporated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it probably is more of that education on the onset of like, we're going to go into prototyping, hypothesis testing phase. But, you know, we want to build in the provisions so that, you know, if we accomplish what we think reasonably, you wouldn't go into prototyping if you didn't reasonably think you could accomplish it. But if this does pan out, then, you know, this would be the second phase of that engagement, just from the onset, because it's hard enough. Like we're a for-profit business that works with nonprofit, and it's hard enough they're investing in it to get them to commit to like more than a 1 year, just because they're so used to just transactional type, you know, they don't know where their money's coming from. They don't know how sustainable a lot of their money is. So they're just used to doing things in sprints. you know, as just a way of everyday business, unless they're the very large, you know, nonprofits that are able to invest in innovation a little bit.
That makes sense.
If
Yeah.
I can jump
Go
in,
ahead.
if I can jump in, what Nathan, what you just mentioned about, you know, there's certain organizations like nonprofits have these sprints, so they don't know where their money is coming from. I'm also thinking of, also I'm gonna I'll switch on my camera so you can see my face for a little bit. I did water, I started building a data information infrastructure around water data. And I made the assumption that people would actually share their data. Silly me. So there's like this, you know, it's almost like the momentum of the organization itself really predicts how they will interact, share their data, what their commitment level is into creating sustainable impact. So for like the nonprofits, like you're saying, Nathan, is, you know, they're just reasonably committed, but maybe for a year. So it doesn't really create that big of a commitment, but then also you have larger, you know, what I work or try to work with were governments and kind of these kind of governing bodies. And they also have a specific momentum, which is really not to change anything, because why change anything?
If it's working, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah, type
Right.
thing. Or at
Right,
least
right.
their incentives are like, keep the trains running on time, don't build a faster train.
Yeah, precisely. So it's just kind of funny. Two different types of organizations essentially have the same outcome. Yeah.
All right, so this is a good transition to what I want to spend the last 20 minutes talking about, which is, you know, I'm going to skip over what we do at BrightHive because I think that's less interesting than what we can do together. We had a good discussion. I think I'll summarize that there's some set of legal, business, or technical challenges. Each of those are big categories that lead to a large percentage of the failures that we've seen. And BrightHive, you know, we were founded to try to solve some of those problems, ideally with some tools and software. We've got kind of a very low level concept called collaboration frame. That's essentially a knowledge graphlet that allows for trusted data sharing. And we can go into that on some other follow-up call if you want. But what can we do together? I think what we're talking around and through is, you know, functionally how we build more collaborative data ecosystems that can promote AI for good. Because and I'll define what I mean by data ecosystem. So Open Data Institute has a really good definition of that. It's made up of the data infrastructure that, like Elizabeth was talking about, water sharing data infrastructure, as well as the people, the communities, organizations that benefit from the value that data infrastructure creates. And the entirety of that is a defined data ecosystem. And when I mean what I mean by collaborative data ecosystem is that this is an arbitrary number, but that the majority of the members, the organizations, communities in that data ecosystem, however its boundaries are defined, are engaged in some version of cross-organizational data sharing. That they are learning from and depending on each other for the use of the beneficial use of data. And this happens, we've seen that when there's proactive reductions in both perceived and real business, legal, and technical barriers that get in the way of allowing for data sharing and collaboration. And this isn't just a pie in the sky thing. We actually think that there's both some technology developments that allow for this to be more feasible now than it was maybe 30 years ago. And there's specific data ecosystems that are getting themselves aligned, getting themselves set up and demonstrating how they can be more collaborative. Now, I want to use an example to close this out with the education to work data ecosystem, kind of building off of the previous example that motivated the overall story. Let's skip over this. So from a people plus technology standpoint, I think the main idea here is that knowledge graphs as a place where people and technology come together are a great way of organizing and enabling more collaborative data ecosystems. And to get very specific, when a business domain or an impact domain get together to develop shared use cases and questions of, what are most important questions, what are the most important questions or use cases for data, when they develop stakeholder personas and roles and develop common data product KPIs, then and put that into a shared knowledge graph for the ecosystem, you allow that entire ecosystem to get to faster business alignment among potential data sharing partners, because they can say, oh yeah, what we need is that use case. We're trying to answer that question or with this set of users and personas. And a great example of this being actively done is actually a group called the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation. I think they're in some ways a sister organization to the AI for Good Foundation. And they have actually today was one of their business pillars work groups where they're doing this in kind of business pillar domain by domain. Second, knowledge graphs provide an organizing structure for more trustworthy legal and policy alignment. You can set up legal rules as code or policies around data as code, and ultimately enable and allow for more modern notions like distributed computational governance that you hear the data mesh community talk about. And then lastly, to what I think Ronnie was talking about before, knowledge graphs allow for more automated alignment among the technologies that need to talk to each other. It's a way to enable better exchange of metadata, allow for the development of shared ontologies within a domain, and even create more common validation rules and expectations. You're seeing this with the Great Expectations project, a great open source project. They're taking a domain-specific approach and setting validation rules for common use cases, domain by domain. This work, right, of developing ecosystem-level knowledge graphs, or at least knowledge graph components, really is, I think, foundational work or enabling work for data sharing and ultimately better AI. And this isn't just a thing that would be nice to do, but no one's ever done before. There's a great example in the education to work ecosystem of this being done. And I'll go through this quickly so we can spend the last 10 minutes talking. But I think this is a really interesting example for us to know about. And full disclosure, we were pretty involved in a lot of the work that's going to be discussed here. So this is less about boosting BrightHive and more about, I think this is really interesting. When we think back to the persona we talked to, the student in that urban school district, we'll call him Jeremy. As he graduates, he's got a lot of questions on his mind. What jobs are available in my region if he's thinking about working right out of high school, or if I want this higher paying job, what skills or credentials do I need in order to get that? Where can I go to get those? Do I do an apprenticeship? Do I go to community college? Do I go to university? Is it something I go to coding boot camp? All these questions are questions that Jeremy's grappling with. And it turns out that there's an opportunity for AI to be super helpful for Jeremy, right? Like these types of questions are types of questions that AI can be really responsive for. You can chatbots that can answer these questions for him. But to solve for that, you have to solve for a language and meaning, language translation problem in the labor market. If he realizes he wants to do one of your guys' jobs, so he's going to train to be a data scientist, the way that data science is talked about, maybe in a college course, it says, great, you're learning unsupervised learning algorithms. In people's resumes, they might say something like, I study data science and predictive modeling. And on the job provider side, they'll say, well, we're looking for someone who can develop insights based on customer behavior. And there's, we know that there's a through line through these three things, but machines don't necessarily know that. And so if you're building a recommendation engine for Jeremy, it says, hey, get this data science degree so you can get this awesome job in your area. You've got to figure out a way to enable skills level translation. If we want AI to help with matching problem in the labor market, like this shows, machines need to understand human skills and competencies as a graph, as a knowledge graph, that relating these linguistic concepts to each other. So this was actually something that a whole group of folks, ourselves included, realized was a critical barrier to better unbiased hiring, better unbiased recommendation engines for careers. There is an old paper-based career tool that was used in a whole bunch of high schools for 30 years that effectively recommended a certain set of jobs to women and a certain different set of jobs to men that were very stereotypical based on whoever designed this. They had some some stereotyping underlying their the design of that particular instrument, and we want to avoid things like that. Right? We want to avoid a world where women are always recommended to be nurses and men are always recommended to be doctors. And it turns out that if you do this language model on just the internet and internet's associations, that's actually what you get in terms of pure associations. So this group, the T3 Innovation Network, came together, said we're going to map our ecosystem, create a community around some shared principles, use cases, and requirements, prioritize those over a set, and really build a distributed shared knowledge graph. And that's what they did. They mapped out the priority questions, built out a community of practice around defining specific use cases, down to the technical standards that are going to be necessary to harmonize data for those use cases, prioritize over the set, looking at a variety of different things that were going on and saying, okay, let's focus on skills data sharing to enable better pathway recommendation systems and unbiased algorithmic hiring. And then built a network called Open Skills Network that functions effectively as a ecosystem level open knowledge graph of skills. I'm just speeding through this. We have a few minutes for discussion. That's now grown to over 1,000 organizations. And effectively, what you're now starting to see is they've got, it's enabling rapid growth in AI-powered career navigation apps that are using better, cleaner, more standard and less biased data to power those recommendations. And you've got a lot of collaborative data ecosystems like that underway. The GovLab does some great work on this, centering around surfacing the highest priority questions for different domains. Data.org is doing some great work on community data ecosystems around health. And I think it behooves all of us in this network to show up for those ecosystem level engagements, bring our AI knowledge to that domain specific work. So I'll stop there, just saying, we can enable more collaboration in the ecosystems we participate in. We can advance some shared principles. And when we do those two things, I think we lay the foundation for better AI for good. And with that, I'll pause and get kind of thoughts and reflections.
I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Matt. It's just really interesting. I spend most of my time in consumer level data where PII, and then in healthcare, PHI is like, most of what we do. So we're really focused on generosity, gratitude, essentially a national pending generosity crisis. So, less people are giving less, and the implications of that are huge, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. How do you share data when the PII and PH, like I get what you're talking about, like water data or other, more kind of benign data, it makes a lot of sense to be able to share assets and combine. When it relates to PII, and kind of, privacy being the new hero, like,
Yeah.
what's that, or is that what BrightHive kind of exists to help do?
Yeah, so we are in the category of mostly focusing on organizations trying to share private data, so sensitive data, PII. To give an example of how that is enabled in the Learn Work ecosystem, we did a lot of work with a core set of stakeholders and a top-level advisory committee called the American Workforce Policy Advisory Committee, around digital infrastructure that would enable better private data sharing for use cases in this area. And ultimately that created a specification called the Learner and Employment Record that allows for Jeremy to have control over his data, consent to its use, but have that consent propagate through kind of systems that, upstream and downstream systems that need it. There's a lot, I would say that this particular, this notion of self-sovereign data is still pretty immature.
Right.
Even in more well-developed, more data mature fields like health. And so the more common model that we work with and see in the PII context is not the individual granting access, but the data steward, the organization that's holding on to PII, setting parameters around that private data use that allow for them that are compliant with what's allowed for at the national level or with the systems they've already agreed to, and there are a variety of strategies and policy enforcement mechanisms to enable that. But I agree with you that that's the thorniest problem in data sharing, and it is something that is one of the main things that we focus on at BrightHive.
And then I'll be quiet, or where you can anonymize data to an extent that makes it more palatable. I was at Notre Dame last week with a couple data scientists who, by the way, brought up Chicago as kind of like the holy grail of like how to do this at scale. And they're trying to do similar things, and we definitely donate data. I know other people can donate data to projects. It's just figuring out how to facilitate that.
Yeah, often what we found is that so one of the things that we've had to do in a lot of our engagements is essentially have a place where the data is staged, and then transformed, anonymized, synthesized, depending on the nature of what can be the policies around that data. That Graphlet can determine, hey, we can only share anonymized versions of data with these following anonymization criteria.
Right.
And they need to be able to stage it someplace, allow that to happen, ensure that it's policy compliant prior to it being shared.
Right. Makes sense.
I know we're at time. Oh no, we're not at time. We got 3 minutes. Other questions?
Alex, I'm curious as to like your expertise in regards to these topics, specifically surrounding kind of like PII and things like that. I wonder what your perspective is on this.
I actually have a very limited perspective on data sharing. Most of my work when I was kind of in the AI field, we didn't really do a lot with big data. Our natural language processing company took the old school rules-based approach. So like large, massive amounts of data, let alone stuff that's pulled from other sources, wasn't really like anything we dabbled in. So I'm just here kind of taking it in and learning as I go.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder, just like personally, like I understand the stewards are probably the primary point of contact to understand how these things, how the data is being used. But to bring it back to like the original user, the original data content creator, like I wonder, is there any kind of like application or means of sharing information towards that group that is accessible to those whose data is being shared? Because I would think that the stewards might have an idea of like what data privacy means and works and things like that, but I bet there's like a knowledge gap amongst those whose data is being shared. I wonder if has that something been considered?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important this is one of the most important unsolved challenges in data empowerment. I put it in that category. A great example of this is actually going back to this underemployment record. The whole idea of this, and this is true of also health, individual health records, electronic medical records that are now allowed to be on your phone. There's been a lot of work by like blockchain companies and others to say, hey, we'll make it so you can trace where all your data is gone, right? Full data provenance. And it turns out that that Jeremy or I as user, I don't want to have to. I'm already annoyed by the fact that I have to accept cookies every time I go to a new website, right? If I have to do that with every reuse of my data and like constantly be managing every place that my digital footprint is being reused for some other purpose, it's frankly a terrible user experience, I guess is the way to say it. No one wants that world, but we also want some notion of like, I want to be able to know. I don't want to wait for the expose article in the New York Times to find out that my data was being used for nefarious purposes. Like, so somewhere between those two extremes of like consent to everything and like actively manage and control every digital trace on your phone, and I don't find out until it's too late. Somewhere in between there, right, is a better world. And I think where we've seen things go the most is that for the majority of cases, there's a data steward, right, who has fiduciary obligations around your data. Those things get set out often in national policy or international policy. This is kind of what everything from California and Virginia's data privacy law to GDPR are trying to do, set some guardrails around data stewardship, and some basic capabilities that say I can opt out, right to be forgotten, all of that. That for a broad set of cases, that's going to be the primary way that data are governed, used, and shared, and the choices are going to be made at the kind of data steward level. But for a subset, it's really important that the individual continues to maintain case-by-case control and visibility. And for that subset of cases, we'll see better technology and better user experiences emerge. That's my read on the situation. I'm curious if you guys see anything different.
The data steward question is one I've been really interested in, because I'm curious to know if that does provide that happy like middle ground between terrible user experience with like overburdensome agreements to how you want your data shared versus like no agency at all for the person whose data is being harvested. So curious to know if you think it's like, does it solve problems? Does it create new problems? Is it just as inefficient as informing the user? Don't really have good answers to that.
Yeah, I know we're over time. I can stick around for a little longer if you guys want to keep the discussion going. But one of the things BrightHive started doing at our very inception is we were all in on new models for data stewardship. In fact, the only thing we did for the first 2 years was help folks set up this thing called a data trust. And one of the things that we found is that data trusts are a good idea. But there's a lot of administrative heft or cruft around it in some ways, and they're not ideal for every situation or every context. And so we needed to expand out our notions of what good data stewardship looked like and the tooling that we could provide to data stewards. So that's been our journey, is going from kind of a monolithic view of what the future of data stewardship looked like to a little more kind of multifaceted view. I mean, this is an area where I think the foundation could provide some, like, we should have a work group that like grapples with this or puts out guidance or thoughts or something like that, because I think this is an area with a lot of need.